Episode 74, a podcast about podcasts. Welcome to the Visionary Variety Podcast, where we cover cool stuff like photo, video, film, books, and technology. So switch on your brain and enjoy the show. Welcome to the podcast. This is going to be some major podcastception happening in your ears, because in this episode, Nate and I are going to talk about a few different things. First, we're going to talk about the history of podcasting and where it came from and how it works. In case you're curious, like, where did it originate? What actually is a podcast? Well, we're going to go over that. And then Nate and I are going to share with you our very favorite podcasts and what we love about them. So if you're looking for some additional podcasts other than this podcast, which is really the only one you need for anything, let's just be honest, right? But there are other podcasts out there. Believe it or not, there are other podcasts in the world. There's actually about 750,000 of them, but more on that later.
Goodness.
So Nate and I will share with you our favorite podcasts and ones that you definitely need to check out. Okay, so let's start with the history of podcasting, and then we'll kind of bring it up to the current day. So back in the day, 2004 was when the very first podcast went live. In 2004. That's crazy, right? It's a long time
People
ago.
are going to be like, that's not that long ago. To all those older listeners, they'll be like, sure, whatever.
Until you do the math and realize that was 15 years. Sheesh.
It's still not even that long, but it is long.
This year, podcasting has really just exploded into, commercial areas. Like, people are making a lot of money off of podcasting.
I feel like podcasts are kind of everywhere.
They really are, and more people know about them, which is great. I feel like last year and the year before that, you kind of mentioned podcasting was sort of like this weird, niche thing, but now it's like more just general people in America are acclimated to them. Earlier, I said some people make a lot of money off of podcasting. I read on Reddit that Joe Rogan makes $30,000 per episode.
Man, we need to get on that. We need to figure out how to get there.
And he does 3 to 4 episodes a week.
Dude,
wow.
If I was getting paid that much, I'd be there every day.
Dude, for real, I would come up with some great content. That's all I do.
I'm going to take my really great idea podcast and I'm going to break it down for 7 episodes in 1 week. That's 30,000 times 7.
Stretch it out to make it last.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, you don't get to that point without great content. So it's kind of a give and take.
Yeah.
So 2004 was when the very first podcast went live. It was done by Adam Curry, who worked for MTV. He was a VJ, so he played music videos. Back when like MTV actually showed music on TV. Remember that?
Yeah, when you tuned in to watch those music videos and all that.
Yeah. So going before 2004, which is when the first podcast went live, there were internet talk radio stations, which were run from people's websites. They would record a weekly or maybe bi-weekly topic, and the listeners or subscribers could download the MP3 of that show. It's kind of the precursor to podcasting. That's pretty much what it is, just with some bells and whistles added. We'll get into later. Yeah, so Carl Malamud had the very first one. It was called Internet Talk Radio.
It's like so original.
Yeah, right. Real creative. On Wired.com, you can find an article written in July of 1994.
Oh,
and
wow.
I almost thought it was a comedy piece at first. I thought it was a parody.
Did you say 94?
1994.
The year I was born? Come on.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. So in this article, it's basically talking about internet talk radio. And it says, if you have 15 megabytes of space, you could download the MP3s.
Oh my goodness.
every week and listen at whenever you want. And then it goes on to say, or you can purchase the cassette tapes for $10 each.
Oh no. Could you imagine having like cassettes and cassettes of episodes, just one?
Dude, that is ultimate nerdiness right there. I have cassettes of network engineer interviews.
What episode do you want to listen to? Do you have a Walkman? Here you go.
Oh, I didn't rewind it. Hold on.
Gosh dang,
let me rewind the podcast.
So 2004 being the start of the first podcast, but in the early 2000s, before podcasting, there were a few computer programs that would scan the internet for shows for MP3 audio files, and you could download them just for you.
Yeah, that must have been really cool. Like, ooh, technology, wow. Ooh. Downloading MP3s to my device. Did you have an MP3 player like around that time?
So I had a little no-name MP3 player, and then I thought I was hot stuff when I got an iPod. I thought it was like, my dad's like, if you get good grades, like if you do good in school, I'll get you an iPod. And I was like, Oh, heck yeah. There is now a reason to pass school.
I have a reason for existence. Oh man.
You were the hot stuff if you had an MP3 player back in the day. Like,
I have a funny story about this. I had an MP3 CD player.
yeah, so did a couple of my friends had the same. I was like, that's so cool.
They were awesome. So I bought it my senior year and in 2007, which later that year is right when the iPhone came out. And everyone had iPhones. Everyone with money had iPhones, and they were listening to their music on iPhones. And I'm like,
Oh, that sucks.
the MP3 CDs were cool because they could hold about 120 songs. It was a lot of memory, It's
Yeah.
700 megabytes worth of MP3s, which was quite a lot. So let's bring it up to around 2004 when the real OG podcast hit the streets. So what happened was RSS feeds, which is basically, I'm trying to make it less technical. And an RSS feed is basically an ongoing, think of your Facebook feed. When someone posts something new, what happens? It pops up on the top. It's got kind of the same format. It's got the same font and size. Everything kind of fits neatly in a format, but there's just new updates, right? So an RSS feed is a feed of items from a single website. So, I don't know, MSNBC.com has a feed. Every time some new article is posted, it's entered into this feed file, which is a text file, kind of like HTML is what it looks like. And each entry into the RSS feed is a specifically coded, very cleanly written description of the article. It also has the title. It has the author of who wrote it, the date and time it was posted, what the topics are, all kind of the basic information of each article without having the actual article itself. The basic info is there in the feed, and it's always being updated anytime something new goes live. So RSS feeds have been around already, but what changed was that there was new tags and codes written for RSS feeds that could include audio file links and the types of information you would need to know if you're listening to, say, a radio or a broadcast episode, which was a podcast episode. So when RSS feeds were updated, that basically meant that we could subscribe to an RSS feed like we always had been. But now with RSS feeds including audio information, we could have a program that could read that RSS feed, could, access the episodes of audio files and download those and have them ready to go. And the great thing about RSS feeds is that it's so simple and lightweight that it's easy to update and easy to download, multiple times an hour. If your program checks an RSS feed every minute, no problem. It's not like it's downloading a ginormous file. It's just downloading the basic link information. So that's basically how podcasts work. Every podcast has an RSS feed, and every time a new episode is posted, usually weekly for most podcasts, the information of that episode is updated into the feed. And programs like iTunes, Google Podcasts, my personal favorite, Pocket Casts, that's the one that you and I use. Sure. They're all reading the RSS feeds and saying, here's a new episode posted this morning at 6:23 a.m. Would you like to download it? You hit yes. It knows where the link is because it's in the feed, and so on and so forth. So when RSS feeds were updated in 2004, boom, podcasting was what it is now. And really, it hasn't changed much. There's probably been a few new tags entered into the coding, but it's really it's a simple system. It's very basic. There's not a whole lot to it. So it hasn't really changed much. What has changed is the popularity of podcasting and the types of content and the level of quality is just, wow. I mean, there are like Hollywood level production audio books, basically, audio dramas in the form of podcasting. And Nate, didn't you listen to a Wolverine one?
Yeah, no, it was like listening to a story. I was on the podcast and it's like the story, I don't even know. It was like the story of Wolverine. I was like, a story on a podcast, and I played it. And I was like listening to an audiobook. I was like, I'm very confused. So they have a wide variety of having audiobooks on podcasts now.
Was there like sound effects and different voice actors?
Not as dramatic as I remember in like the audiobooks, but for what it was presenting, a little bit.
When the true crime podcasts exploded like a few years ago, and they're still just going crazy. Like everyone listens to some true crime podcast, except for me. I'm the only one. But there's also a lot of story-based podcasts that kind of followed in that trend. So that's basically the little, very short version of how podcasting came to be. It really stemmed out of internet radio, MP3 players being more affordable and getting more space. In 2005, iTunes caught the podcasting bug, and they included RSS feed reading in their iTunes program. You would have to search for the podcast first. So any podcast that wants to be on iTunes had to submit their RSS feed to iTunes, and it basically included it into their directory. So Like when you type in science fiction, it would search through all of the keywords of each RSS feed, which describes each podcast, right? So, our podcast has a lot of descriptive words because we cover so much. So, but if there's one that had sci-fi in it, it would pop up in your search results. And if you subscribe to it, iTunes would continually look at that RSS feed about every hour. At least that's what it does now, and updates itself.
I'm curious to see what happens in 2019 because they're already talking about retiring iTunes. I'm just like, I know there's a lot of other sources out there, but that's just crazy. Like crazy to me that iTunes is separating their stuff.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. iTunes is not the only place where podcasts come from. Like you said, there's plenty of other services. So if iTunes totally disappeared, podcasting would still go on.
They'll have all the Apple podcast stuff. It's just the word iTunes will be gone.
But websites like I said earlier, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pocket Casts, Android, Google Podcasts, they all have their own directory of RSS feeds. So if you make a podcast, you want to submit your RSS feed to as many services as possible. And right now we're on about maybe 9 or 10. I just recently submitted our feed to iHeartRadio
because it just we're hit on me the radio. I was joking.
Well, it's not really radio.
Come on, don't pop my bubble. It has the word radio in it.
So you can tell all your friends I'm on the radio. That is in the process. We got approved on Spotify like a week or two ago. So that's cool. It's a really big platform right now. A lot of people are using Spotify for podcasts. Yeah. So let's come up to current day. So fast forward about 15 years to 2019. Here are some very, very interesting numbers that I got. Most of them were from podcastinsights.com. It's a very specific website. I wonder what they have on that website. So podcastinsights.com, here's some numbers I got. There are currently, they're a rough estimation, 750,000 active podcasts.
Goodness.
And I think that's just English podcasts.
Oh my.
Yeah, there's a lot of foreign ones. This is not an American Western thing. There are also over 30 million episodes as of June in 2019.
Goodness, come on. So, that's crazy.
That's a lot. Yeah. That's
content for days.
Okay, I just did the math. I'm a nerd. Check this out. If each podcast episode out there in the internet world is 1 hour long, which they generally are, sometimes
more or less. It depends on the episode.
Yeah, so let's pretend they're an hour each, right? So that we got 30 million hours of listening. So how many days is that? It's just over 1 million days.
I'll just, well, I won't be here no more, but the podcast will still go on and on.
They will go on. They will live on. As far as popularity goes, 51% of the population of America has listened to a podcast. That's a lot. That's way more than I thought. I thought it'd be like 15 or 20. 49% of listening is done in the home, which is, again, surprising to me. 22%. Yeah. Chores is a great time. Mowing the lawn, perfect time for podcasts. 22% of listening is done in the car. I thought that would be much higher.
That's crazy. That should be so much higher.
Yeah, that's like pretty much all my listening is in the car.
Yeah.
And 11% at work. That really depends on your work. Like if you're doing very detail-oriented attention.
I mean, you really can't be a call service and be on the podcast, listening to a podcast, taking a phone call.
Hold on, let me pause my podcast. How can I help you? Yeah, it really depends on your type of work. When I'm fixing stuff at work, when I fix ATM machines, I can listen and take in most of it because it's just different parts of my brain. I guess it works for me.
Yeah.
But not for everybody.
Yeah,
so be careful. Don't listen to podcasts if you need to, like if you're a policeman or something like that. Probably a bad idea. Lifeguard, probably a bad idea.
It's crazy to think that you see these numbers in front of us, and one day the radio's not going to be a thing. It's just dude, it's just crazy.
Earlier, I said podcasting is not just a Western and American thing. South Korea is actually the leading country for the highest population percentage that listens to a podcast. I did not know that. That blew my mind. So they're at 58% listener rate, or rather that 58% of the population has listened to a podcast in the last month.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and America is just fifth. We're at 33% in the past month. Yeah. I think Sweden is just above us. I forgot the other numbers, but you can find them at podcastinsights.com. As far as mainstream, attention to podcasting, which there is plenty of now, New York Times, the magazine, has a podcast. They also have been covering podcasts since 2004. So this is something that has been on their radar ever since. NPR, which I mostly enjoy on the radio. There's some bits that I don't care for, but NPR has a number of podcasts. They're kind of like shorter versions of their news information updates and some topical stuff out there. So NPR is on the podcast bandwagon. And one of my favorite podcast producers, howstuffworks.com, has about 50 podcasts. That's crazy.
I see that tag everywhere.
They're taking over the podcast world. I think they're buying up podcasts. Like some upstart says, "Hey, I got this cool idea," and they're like, "Nope, here's $1 million. It's now ours." I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. They got money
across the stage. There's $1 million just disappear. We own this now.
Under the table. So if you want to check out their podcast, just go to stuffmedia.com and you can find their list of podcasts. And they make good. Like they make, I want to say, some of the best podcasts out there right now. The content is great. The people are really good personalities. There's a lot of variety. Yeah. Like they've got a show about conspiracy theories. They've got a show about history. They've got one about technology. What about animals and married relationships? Like there's a lot of topics that they've covered very well. So definitely check out their podcast. You will for sure find something that you like. And I'll talk about my favorites later in the episode. Another crazy thing that I've learned about recently is that super popular podcasters are actually doing live tours of their podcast. Did you know that?
We should do that.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of crickets in that auditorium. Can you imagine? That would be so sad.
No, we'd have our family show up. Hey, Mom.
All right, I'm going to rant a little bit to you listeners out there listening. I know you're listening. I don't know who you are. I don't know how many of you there are. I have a rough estimate of how many downloads there are per week, and it's not a lot. It's between 100 and 200 a week. But we never hear from you guys, so
we miss you.
There's a lot of crickets. Yeah, shame on you. There's a lot of crickets going on right now.
We just miss you.
I don't know. I want to throw some shade on you guys because I want some emails. I want some comments. I want you to say, "Hey, I've listened to your podcast since the beginning, and it's the highlight of my week every week." I don't know, something. I got to hear back from you guys, please. So we've got a few emails. There have been a few emails. We haven't had total silence.
Hey, if you want to talk to us, we're more than willing to listen.
Mm-hmm. We're real people.
Yeah.
You can reach us anytime at tvvpodcast@gmail.com. All right. So I kind of went over already how podcasts work. So basically, when we finish recording an episode, I edit it. I cut out all the little mistakes and sneezes and coughs. And
that's why we sound so good. We're so polished and clean because of you.
Yeah. We do not do one-take recordings.
We're getting better. 70 plus episodes, we're getting a heck of a lot better.
Oh, yeah.
Like back in the day, it was like a sentence and then we'd have to pause and think and then like a sentence.
It took us like 2 or 3 hours to get through an episode. Now it's only 2 hours. So once the episode is finished recording, I edit the heck out of it, make it all nice and pretty, put the music on the beginning and end, and little bloopers at the end. In case you haven't caught on, there's a post-credit scene taken a play from the Marvel playbook that we do funny bloopers at the end of every episode. So you definitely want to check those out. But once the file is finished, it's an MP3 file. I upload it to my website, which is actually danielgrovephoto.com, that we just use that for the storage of the files because they do have to be stored somewhere, which traditionally you're going to have to pay for some storage somewhere. There are some free options, but there's also limitations to them. So if you're going to have a long-term podcast or long episodes, you're going to need to store them somewhere and pay a little bit of money to have that storage.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep. So once it's hosted on a website or a server somewhere, then I update the RSS feed, which for me, WordPress does it automatically. And it includes the new episode name and the link and the description and all that jazz for each episode. And voila, I'm done. So after that point, all the apps out there, they're grabbing out at all the feeds that have been submitted and they're updating themselves. And then that's how the listener, finds us and listens to us. So there you go. Now you understand podcasting.
Welcome to our podcast. Yeah. I'm joking.
Nate, how do you listen to your podcast and when?
Dude, back in the day, it was iTunes, and then you introduced me to Pocket Cast, and I was like, thank you. That was like a gift from God.
Because came to the light side.
Because I had Android, and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to listen to all this stuff. So
you're welcome.
But a lot of the time, when I hear someone throw out a podcast, I'll go to Pocket Cast and see if they're catching their information, and I'll just start from there.
Yeah, I like Pocket Cast because it just puts the episode listing, it lists all the episodes in one place. Most websites, you can listen on their website, but you have to be on a computer, and I'm not when I'm driving. Yeah. So when do you listen? Do you listen like while you drive, while you work, or what?
Anytime I can.
Yeah.
I listen home, driving, sometimes and like at work. I mean, if I can, kind of all the time. If it's not like music, it's a podcast. If it's not podcast, it's an audiobook. But I'm gonna be honest, it's more podcast than audiobook.
I go back and forth. I'll find a really good audiobook and I'll just listen to that only till I finish it. And then I might get another one or read the sequel. And I'll usually do like 2 or 3 audiobooks at a time, and then I'll kind of rebound and go back to podcasting for about a month. And I bounce back and forth.
You nerd. 2 or 3 audiobooks in a couple weeks.
If they're really good, yeah.
I don't know. The other Daniel has you beat, I think.
Yeah, he definitely does. That dude can listen at 2x speed, and he doesn't stop. He listens like all throughout the day, and I can't do that because I lose interest. I lose focus on the audiobook if I'm listening while I do like other stuff. So for myself, like I said, I listen while I drive mostly, and while I do some work tasks. Sometimes it takes a little bit more of my brain power, so I can't listen. Like I can't enjoy it and work effectively. So I'll just work and hit pause. But I use my phone, of course. I download them before I head out the door, have the episodes on my phone, and I don't need internet. I use a Bluetooth headset, which if you're really looking for a good one, I use the LG HSB 770. I think it was a little over $100, but it's good. It'll vibrate when someone calls you. It has a fast forward and rewind switch on the side, and then on the other side it has volume. And it's really well made, and the battery is really good. Like I've used it for 2 days, like a lot of like heavy usage for 2 days, and the battery died at the end of the second day. So that's pretty impressive.
I have to hand it to Pocket Cast, dude, to have the option to trim out some of the silence and speed up the audio.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Pocket Cast, other than speeding up your listening speed, which pretty much all apps have that, you can do a silence trim. So if people take long gaps in between talking, it'll just bloop, cut that out, and you're right back into it.
So good.
It keeps track of all the statistics of how much time you've saved. So you can actually look at how many seconds of silence is cut out since you started, how much time you've saved by speeding up podcasts. It's pretty geeky, but I like it. So, Nate, why don't you tell us about the origin of this podcast? Like, why are we doing this? Where did it all come from? How did it start?
So, it all started when I met Daniel on the side of the road. I was joking.
Funny story.
No, back, I don't know, man. We started hanging out a lot, and we were having some of these crazy conversations. And I'm like, man, we've been talking for like 2 hours. And I was like,
multiple times.
Oh, like we'd be at a shoot, and I'd be helping you video or be an assistant, or we'd just be at an event. And before and after, we just have this ongoing conversation. I'm just like, man, that was good stuff. We should have recorded that. And I was like, man, I want to start a podcast, but yeah, I don't know really how to do that. And so I remember throwing the idea out to Daniel. Like we were sitting there eating pizza one day at like Mod Pizza, and you were like, yeah, that's cool. You should totally do that. I was like, dang it, he didn't get the hint. And so I was like,
on your own.
Yeah, have fun. And I was like, yeah. And so he was like super interested. And I was just like, I'm going to let that simmer a little bit. I'm going to do a lot of research, a lot of understanding, and just go with it. And I didn't do anything. And I was like, I'm going to wait. So I kind of brought it up a couple more times. And maybe a year later, after me doing a lot of research, I was like, we should start a podcast. You're like, let's do it. And I think I just randomly messaged you out of the blue.
It was your fault. I felt a little pushed into it because you were so excited about it, and I wasn't like against it, but I'm really glad I went with it. I was just like, you know what? Let's just take the leap. Like it's more your thing, more your idea, your passion than mine. But I'm really glad I did it because it's been awesome. So let it be known, this is Nate's fault. If we get in any trouble, it's Nate. Okay, so let's get to some of our favorite podcasts, some really good recommendations for the listeners out there. Nate, what are some of your favorite podcasts and why?
Oh, I'm kind of all over the map. I like the talk show host. I like the geeky stuff. I think I'm going to just start with the podcast called Tested, still untitled, with Adam Savage. It's kind of more of a sit-down interview conversation piece about what's going on, movies. So they kind of do everything we do, but on a different scale because they actually get the chance to hang out with Hollywood people.
That will change soon for us.
Of course, there's a podcast out there that does just movies, and it's called Popcorn Theology. Those guys watch everything, like in anything.
They know their stuff.
I'm like, who are these people? Like, I'm not gonna lie. Like, if we ever did a podcast with them, I'd be super intimidated with the knowledge they have about movies.
And they bring some really cool theology to the table about the movies, which I really like.
Dude, I know. Like, I'm like, where do you get this information from? And then, of course, Strangers and Aliens. And
Yep.
I haven't listened to them recently, but man, it was still one of my favorite. And just the conversation that they got going on, both super cool, like a super cool group.
I think that was the very first podcast that I really listened to. It was that one and Stuff You Should Know, which we'll get to later. But
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Strangers and Aliens was the very first one. And honestly, I don't remember how it all started. Like me listening to podcasts, I don't remember how it started. I don't even know how I found the Strangers and Aliens podcast.
Yeah, I have no idea. You just told me, you should check it out. And then kind of back to the talk show host kind of interview is the Relevant podcast, which Josh,
that's a good one.
We've had him on the show. He's told me about and got really into that. And then the guy that runs kind of the whole thing with the Relevant podcast, they're a magazine company that has a podcast. And then they have with the Cam and Strain, it's called The Unedited, which basically it's just interviews with lots of people. And that's really good. And then Curious with Josh Peck. Yes, the guy from Drake and Josh has a podcast, and he's a cool guy.
What do they cover?
Similar to The Unedited with Cam and Strain and The Relevant, kind of just more of an interview podcast instead of just like topics and stuff.
With like pop culture icons or musicians or what?
Musicians, actors, anything. And then, of course, we had the Sci-Fi Christian.
Yeah.
And you know what's funny is like I had to stop listening to him for a little bit because how the negativity that was coming from one side.
Yeah.
No, I'm just picking on them. They're cool guys. And then I find myself outside of the geeky kind of stuff. Like I said, I really enjoy the interview style. It's called The Ground Up Show. And that one, he's a YouTuber that has a podcast. And so he kind of does interviewing with a lot of like motivational speakers and professionals and actors. And so he's more on the self-help, self-building, more on just bragging that he has a podcast. And then, of course, our podcast, the episodes that I'm not on, I get to listen to. And, hey, Daniel, that sounded really good. But like there's a little hiccup. He's like, oh, crap. But
you forgot to edit out your fart at 2 minutes and 3 seconds.
Daniel's like, no, that was on purpose.
All right. Well, here's my list of podcasts that I love to listen to. Now, I don't keep up with all of these because you're going to find out there's quite a bit. But these are podcasts that I have listened to at least 3 or 4 episodes, some of them upwards close to 100. So there's a big range here. There is a handful that I actively keep up with every week, but I kind of just went through my list of all the podcasts that I've listened to, and these are the ones that I have been very impressed with and have really, really loved or benefited from. All right, so at the top of my list has to be How Stuff Works and their vast array of podcasts. Like I said earlier, they have about 50 total podcasts, and you can find all of them on their website, stuffmedia.com, all the descriptions and, of course, the links and everything like that. Very impressive set of podcasts. But the first one on my list for them is Stuff You Should Know. I love this podcast. This is honestly one of the very first, possibly the second podcast I ever listened to, aside from, I think, Strangers and Aliens podcast. I think that was the first. But yeah, this one is awesome. It's you just learn. You just learn a lot from this podcast. They cover a bunch of different topics from science to history to people to pop culture. It's really very random, which kind of inspired my podcast and how this show is a variety show, and we don't really stick to one topic because that's just not how my brain works personally. So I assume it's not how y'all's works either. But yeah, Stuff You Should Know is really fun, very lighthearted. It's clean and educational. My next is a spin-off podcast from that one. It's called Short Stuff, which basically is Stuff You Should Know, but for the topics that really only take up about 5 to 10 minutes to explain. Some of the more simple stuff. Still very fun, and it's short and easy to digest. So it's very short episodes. I think they're no more than 10 minutes long. Next is Stuff to Blow Your Mind. Similar to Stuff You Should Know, but a little bit more edgy and more just wow. I think they're a little bit more aimed at science as well. Very fun. I love it. Next is Tech Stuff. This one covers all things technology. Really interesting. A lot of history as well. The guy likes to rewind and explain the origins of things before he gets into the current state of stuff, which I think is great because understanding the past of technology really helps you to understand and appreciate where we are today. So Tech Stuff is a great one. Next is Stuff They Don't Want You to Know. And this one is fun because they focus more on the conspiratorial side of things, conspiracy theories, weird stuff that makes you say, or what if? And they do their best to explain things. I like this show because they take a really good stance on a lot of stuff. They're very neutral. They're very middle ground. They don't get crazy with the conspiracies, but they also do admit that there are secrets, there are lies, and there are things that have been covered up by the government and other people. So really well done, well researched, and I love how they approach a lot of topics. Next is stuff you missed in history class. Pretty self-explanatory. They talk about stuff you maybe forgot about in history class or stuff they didn't teach you for whatever reason. Next one is similar. It's called Ridiculous History. This one's funny because they talk about just weird stuff that happened in history that is great for discussions. You know, when you need something interesting to talk about at a party or something just to make someone laugh and say, you know, did you know about this? This podcast, as well as all of these, really are great for conversation starters. Next is Alchemy This. This is a comedy podcast, which honestly I've never really looked into, and I think there is a large portion of podcasts that are dedicated to comedy, comedians, and just overall funniness. Now, I do have to give you a little disclaimer. This podcast is not clean or family friendly. There's a lot of cursing. There's a lot of foul language and dirty jokes. Not really my normal flavor, honestly. I like to keep things clean. But this is a little bit of an exception to my rule. It makes me laugh my head off almost every time. What they do is they do skits. They do ad-lib, and people send in ideas for sketches, and they just do it on the spot. I think it's 4 different comedians that have their own, stand-up routine going on their own, but they're all together in the studio, and they do really, really funny sketches and skits and just crazy characters and voices, and it is really funny. So check it out, but be aware who else is listening behind you. Next is Part-Time Genius. That's a really fun podcast that inspired me a lot. Next is Invention. This is a newer one. Invention podcast covers the specific inventors that made things throughout history, whether old or ancient or new. They also talk about the inventors themselves and the way that they changed history, and they left their mark with their invention. Very cool. Really enjoyed that. Okay, and last on the list of How Stuff Works podcasts is The End of the World with Josh Clark. This is a really cool, mind-bending, and thought-provoking podcast that basically talks about different world-ending scenarios, whether it be natural disasters, artificial intelligence taking over, you name it, all kinds of crazy scenarios that honestly a lot of movies and books may be based on or incorporate certain ideas from. But I think it's great to think about this stuff so we can prevent it and be prepared in case something crazy does happen. All right, moving on. That's just the How Stuff Works podcast. I'll try to speed this up. Okay, the next podcast I'm going to talk about are what I categorized as geek culture podcasts. This is anything nerdy, geek, entertainment, sometimes technology. First on this sublist is Strangers and Aliens. I think this is my very first podcast I ever listened to, and I love it. These guys are funny. They are very knowledgeable. Their personality types are very different, so the episodes and discussions are always very colorful and dynamic. But most of all, I like it because these guys are born-again believers, and they're all involved in ministry as well. So what that means for this podcast is they may review the next Avengers movie or what have you, or the next comic book, or the next TV show that's out, but they'll also talk about it in a Christian perspective next to, the normal secular perspective. So sometimes in the movie reviews, they'll talk about different Christian themes that may be in the movie, whether purposefully or not. And I just like how they can view, stuff that I love through a biblical perspective, and brings a lot of interesting ideas and stuff to the table. One of the guys on that show, Ben Avery, he also has another podcast called Welcome to Level 7. So this show is a little bit like Strangers and Aliens, but what they do is they do specific reviews of television shows, and there's a few movie reviews in there too, but mostly TV shows like Cloak and Dagger, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Defenders, The Runaways, Daredevil, things like that. Pretty much all superhero shows, but I'm sure if you go back in time, you'll find some other TV shows as well. Okay, next is the Sci-Fi Christian. Obviously, as the name implies, it's a Christian podcast, or rather, it is hosted by people who are Christians, and they talk about all kinds of interesting topics, similar to Strangers and Aliens, but sometimes they get a little bit deeper into the philosophical and analysis of certain things like movies, comic books. Sometimes they're just topics, like just general discussion topics on something interesting that pertain to, geek or nerd culture. So definitely check it out. They've got some really great discussions, and I've learned a lot from them. Next is the Anomaly Podcast. This is run by two wonderful ladies who actually are local to me. I think they live in New Braunfels, which is not far from me, about 20 minutes. Really awesome women. They're very knowledgeable, very funny, very loving and nice, and they've got some really great topics that I love, and I really enjoy just the way that they discuss different topics of movies and geek culture. They do a phenomenal job. That podcast has been going on for like 12 years, which is crazy. They've been going on for a long time. That means they've been doing this almost since the beginning of podcasting, which is definitely some serious bragging rights. Next is Imaginary Worlds. This podcast I love because I learn a lot from it. What they do is they talk about the different fictional worlds that we know and love. Whether it's Middle Earth from J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's Narnia or the Star Wars world, different fictional universes, but also with the things that make up those worlds that we love so much, whether it's prop design or costumes or interesting, fictional technologies and worlds and things that we just enjoy. They have really interesting interviews too. Sometimes they get someone on the show that actually made the thing or designed or wrote the story or whatever. So very deep, very well done. I love that show. And last on this sub list of geek culture podcasts is the Free Play Podcast. The hosts of this show are also Christians, like some of their previous ones are. And they also talk about video games. They talk about news, in the geeky world, sometimes TV shows and stuff like that. I definitely enjoy this podcast as well. Okay, my next group of podcasts are movie-related podcasts. Now, don't worry, there's only 3 of them. We're getting to the end. The first one is How Did This Get Made? This podcast is hilarious. They basically take a really terrible movie and they ask the question, how did this get made? And they've got some big names in this show. I listened to an episode recently with Seth Rogen, and it was a live show. So these people know what they're doing. They've got a really big following, really great content. Now, it is on the raunchier, maybe not safe for work side. So beware. Very funny, but it gets dirty sometimes, and they don't care about cuss words. So if that bothers you, this may not be a podcast for you. But if you love to roast movies and talk about really terrible movies that somehow got big budgets, this might be one you'll enjoy. Next is Effectively Speaking. This podcast, they talk about the special effects of movies, whether it's visual effects, computer-generated images, or practical effects. They go over all kinds of really cool behind-the-scenes stuff of how stuff was made, the technologies that were used, and the good and bad of all that stuff in between. Okay, the next one is the VFX Guide Show. So VFX Guide is a really well-known website that also breaks down special effects. They've got educational stuff. They've got behind-the-scenes videos and some really great interviews with big names in the movie industry that made or oversaw special effects of various kinds being made. So just like the previous one, they basically break apart movies and TV shows and talk about how really cool scenes were made. Okay, next is the Photography and Business Podcasts. So first is the Pay to Pixel Podcast with Sharky James. I had to say that because he says it in every episode. This podcast goes over a bunch of different photography-related news items, whether it's a new camera coming out or some photographer did something really stupid and got sued for it or, whatever. Really interesting stuff. And honestly, if you're in the photography industry, you need to listen to this podcast because you're going to learn stuff that you'll need to know eventually. So a Pay to Pixel podcast is awesome. And the website that it comes from is also really excellent. Next is the Side Hustle School. So this podcast is really inspirational to me, and the episodes are super short. They're like 10, 15 minutes, I think. And what this guy does is each episode covers the story of an entrepreneur of some kind, whether it's someone who baked cookies and now they make a 6-figure income out of their house, someone who started an online website for teaching, Photoshop lessons, or someone who started selling lemonade on the side of the street and now they've got a growing business. You name it, it's been covered. I actually have an episode about my story with my cosplay photography. It's episode 119, and it was done in April of 2017. So if you want to listen to that one specifically, just Google that, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. If you're an entrepreneur of any kind, just listening to this show will pump you up and give you that inspiration that you may need to go to the next level or just to keep on pushing. Because being an entrepreneur is hard. You definitely need sources of inspiration and education, such as this podcast, to keep you going. Okay, so that's it for the photography and business podcasts. Next are a few just random ones that kind of stand on their own. So first is the Relevant Podcast. This is a really fun podcast done by some great Christians that are associated with the Relevant magazine, of course. And they talk about all kinds of topics, mostly pop culture stuff. And it's not just Christian news. Like, this is not just churchy, Christian-y stuff. Like, they talk about, secular music, movies, TV shows, good, bad, and ugly, all that kind of stuff that's happening in the secular news. They give a great Christian perspective on it, and it is hilarious. These guys are just so funny. Every episode, they're developing inside jokes that you can follow and enjoy, and it's just really silly. It's a lot of fun to listen to, and they also have Christian musicians on there that that I like. So it's fun to get the interviews and the inside information from various people, whether they're Christian or not Christian. Next is the Bible Project. This is a Bible study podcast. Each episode kind of goes through chunks of the Bible, and it is deep. Not too deep where you can't follow it, but you are going to learn some stuff. This is not surface level Bible education. This is for those who really want to be a well-educated Christian that understands not only the Bible, but what it means to be a believer, what it means to have a relationship with God. It's just a really great theological podcast. And if you're not a Christian and you've never really heard great Bible teaching, I would suggest you check out a few episodes of this podcast. It may open your eyes a little bit to something that you may not have ever been exposed to, especially if you've just gone to church. This is not stuff you'll hear on a Sunday morning sermon. So check it out. It's great. Next is the TED interview. So in this podcast, short and sweet episodes, they interview various people that I guess have had TED Talks of their own. Inspirational, educational, very cool stuff. Next is Houston, We Have a Podcast. So this is done by NASA. This is like an official NASA podcast. And they have interviews with people, rocket scientists, for example. And they talk about all kinds of cool stuff, whether it's, new scientific discoveries in space, new satellites being made on Earth, all kinds of cool stuff that NASA's up to. And if you love space and astronomy, you got to check this one out. All right, second to the last, we're almost done here, is the Lizard People Podcast. This is another conspiracy theory podcast, but don't worry, this podcast is not populated by wackos that just believe everything that comes across the internet. This is more of an entertaining podcast, and how it works is the host of the show, she brings on her friends who are comedians, so it's going to be funny, and basically each guest of each episode gets to propose a theory, whether that if they really truly believe it or if they just really kind of doing it for kicks and giggles. You never quite know, but it is really funny because each episode, the person defends their stance, the host, kind of smashes it to pieces, they kind of weigh it and vote it on how believable it is. It's very lighthearted, but it is very funny. Also, a little bit on the raunchier side, so protect young ears. This may not be a podcast for you if that kind of content bothers you. Okay, the last podcast on my list. This is a silly one, the Ron Burgundy Podcast. Yes, Ron Burgundy has a freaking podcast. It is stupid. It is funny. It is random. I honestly don't know how long it's going to last, but they've got the man himself, Will Ferrell, as himself, Ron Burgundy, on the podcast, and it is really funny. Very silly. A little bit mature, a little bit raunchy again. Prepare yourself for typical Ron Burgundy shenanigans, because that's what it's all about. All right, well, that's my long, exhaustive list. I hope you guys check out these podcasts and benefit from them, whether it's through education or just pure entertainment. You are welcome. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Give us some feedback, please. We would love to hear back from you guys. What are your favorite podcasts? Do you like any of the ones that Nate and I follow? Let us know. You can email us at tvvpodcast@gmail.com, or you can comment on any of our social media posts. We would love to hear back from you guys. Thanks for listening, and have a great week. If you like this show, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can also find our previous episodes there and listen whenever you want. We love to hear from our listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future episodes, you can reach us at tvvpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and have a great week. Hold on. Seriously, Zippy? Okay.